Hello everyone and welcome to this session on diversity for doers and newbies. So first of all, please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Jennifer Stirrup. I've got postgraduate degrees in artificial intelligence and cognitive science, and I've been in the industry for 23 years now. And I've written books on machine learning, and I have been delivering projects all over the world for a very long time. So this topic is an interesting one for me because I think diversity, inclusion and equality are things that we can learn about so much more all the time, myself included. So this session is really aimed at people who want to do something positive for diversity and inclusion in their workspaces and their communities. I'm interested in how I can give people a quick impact. So we will have a look at unconscious bias in our systems, our solutions and how we interact with others. We'll also look at keeping people safe and how we can be more inclusive. And I think there's a lot that we can cover. Unfortunately, we've only got a short period of time to do so, but you have my contact details if you have any questions or comments. Now, just to let you know, I am still learning too. I'm learning every day, and I think it's important that we all try to do better. I'd like to point you towards this framework, which is something that I use when I'm trying to think about how to make a difference for diversity and inclusion and equality in organisations. The concept is really about leveraging difference. It can help people to navigate what can be quite a confusing subject area. So how can we leverage difference? And what paths can we take in order to make people safe when we do so? It's about trying to use people's distinctive competencies and their perspectives as a way of enhancing our communities and our organisations. Differences often escape perception. We have our own worldviews, and those constrain our capacity. Now, if you have read the book Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, he wrote that in the 1950s, and he described in this novel the invisible man, someone who's present and active in the world, but simply ignored by the virtue of cultural, social, and the political norms of the day. Ellison was describing the experience of African Americans in the United States at the time. The metaphor, however, also applies to people from other backgrounds. For example, there's some research which shows that women's ideas can be ignored until a male colleague says the same thing and applauded for his insight. When we do tests afterwards, people often don't remember that the woman said these ideas, and often they just don't see her as a participant at all. They don't remember what she said or what her contributions were. So our perceptions are something that we have to try and think about very consciously in order to do better for ourselves and for other people. The thing is that what we do affects people around us, whether we understand that or not. Now, regardless of our backgrounds, we all have quite similar struggles in the world in some ways. We want to change the world and make it better, and that's a good thing. It means that we can start small. We can turn lots of little actions into something much bigger. All these small things start to add up. And hopefully we can start to judge people by the size of their hearts and not too many awards they have won or how many successes they are perceived to have. And I think that would be a good way forward. So let's have a little bit more in-depth look at diversity, inclusion and equality and how we can make our communities better and safer for people. So let's have a look at implicit or unconscious bias. And you can see we have a description here. The brain produces shortcuts, and these shortcuts or heuristics are something that we use when we navigate everyday life. However, they can work against us. They can also produce cognitive illusions of our knowledge and our experience. Humans are incredibly adaptable. We are the apex predator, and if we can recognize our unconscious way of thinking, then we can start to overcome it as well. So here's a few things that we can think about when we are considering bias. Here we have the seed model of bias, where we start to look at different ways in which bias might creep into our thinking. And these are heuristics that we can start to use in everyday life, and they can work against us. For example, the principle of similarity. If we start to have that halo effect where we think that similar people are somehow better, then that's obviously a very faulty way of thinking. It's also very arrogant, because if we start to think we are better than other people, what we're really saying is that we have the right to judge, and our judgment goes, and we have the right to judge who is more rational than someone else, for example. But when we start to think about other people, for example, in hiring or picking speakers for events, similarity can work against us. So these are the sorts of biases we can start to unpick in our own thinking. So there's also the concept of experience, where people have a bias of thinking, well, if it feels right, then it must be true. That's not the case. And what I do see, for example, in data science, is people are very led by how they feel about the data. Even though we are a data community, I think we are often very far away from being data-driven. I think what happens is we tend to pick the data or the information that we like or that our friend says us. And I think that is not a good way to be. I think we need to think about how we choose which content we review. I know that I've been blocked, for example, on social media by people explaining it was a content choice and they didn't like what I said. That's fine, but it kind of gives me no opportunity to present alternative points of view that would provide evidence for people to change their minds. If you are not at least willing to have a look at what the other point of view is, then that's not really being data-driven. And when we start to look at bias, we have to understand that the way we choose our content can make us into an echo chamber, where we just become very narrow in our thinking, and we don't want that. The point of diversity is that it's diverse, right? That should be how it works. We also end up with the case where people's experience is statistically significant to them, but that means it's only statistically significant out of experience of one person. It really means that we can be more data-driven when we start to think about things. And that just doesn't mean just throwing around one or two statistics and making it so that it proves the point. Data science doesn't and shouldn't work like that. And in our everyday lives, hanging on to just one statistic is not really the way forward. Again, we're coming back to limiting our content choices. It's about being widely read and trying to remove these stereotypes that are in our heads. So we've also got a few other concepts as well. Distance and safety. Bad is stronger than good. So sometimes our sense of fear can drive our decisions. Fear will always play a part in our lives, and it certainly does in mine. But the thing with fear is we get to decide how much of a part it is going to play in our lives. So fear will always play a part in our lives, but we get to decide how much. So when I speak about these topics, I do have an element of fear, because I know people are not going to like it or they are going to ignore it. Again, it's about trying to be data-driven and look at alternative points of view. When we start to think about making decisions or collecting data based on fear, then what we can do is start to think about making decisions based on love instead, assuming good intentions, and also trying to measure people by the size of their heart and what they do, not what they achieve. It's also about thinking about our fear disguised as practicalities. So, for example, deciding that you are not going to speak out or support someone who is experiencing issues which come under the diversity, inclusion and equality umbrella. When you do that, people's fear starts to get disguised in practicalities. For example, if I speak out on LinkedIn, will that mean people will disconnect from me? Or if I say something in Twitter, does that mean that I'm going to get trolled or ignored, maybe? But I think if you let your life be driven by that fear all the time, then you're not going to have the ability to change the world around you. And what we do right now, starting here, can really change the world by being kinder and thinking about how we can examine how we approach data and information and what we can do to make things better for ourselves and for other people. So first impressions. You can see here, the first impressions can make a difference. And this is a matter for our perception as well as how we think. It's so unconscious, we need it pointed out to us sometimes. In the community and also in the workplace, we can adopt a stance where difference matters. But to do that, in order to enlarge our capacities to see the differences in diversity, we must widen our perceptual lens when we are looking at differences. We can use different techniques to enable people to see differences more clearly, because until we see differences, we can't value them. And that's about understanding, widening our circle of friends perhaps, thinking about what information we take in, and it can just simply about the relationships that we are trying to build. Are our relationships in the workplace or outside of it based on people who are similar to us? We can work to understand how these differences matter, but we have to see the differences first in order to understand them. And sometimes it is perceptual. So I've got a few more examples. This is the shepherd elephant. It's a form of cognitive illusion in which our assumptions about the world are challenged in a falsified image. And what you can see here is our brain works to understand this image based on what it knows about the world. And cognitive illusions are a really nice way of showing us how our brain does this all the time, and we don't question ourselves. Here's another example. Can you see where the man is hiding? I'm not going to tell you. You can look this up for yourself. This is the coffee bean illusion. Now, the coffee beans have skewed your perception of the content surrounding the man. and it's driven by the colour of the coffee beans. And this is a common problem in how we form opinions of others, and that can be based on skin colour, religion, accents, clothing, tattoos, piercings, unusual earrings, how low a woman's top is, all that, the whole thing. These things influence what we think of other people, whether we like it or not. Even if we don't realise it, these little things often have very little to do with people's character and the size of their hearts. So we have to think about how our perception is being skewed by other content. Now, to drive that point home, you can see here which one has got the bigger size. Actually, they're both the same size, but the bricks in the backgrounds change the perception of the figures, so the man looks taller. The same goes for our thoughts that live in the background of our minds. The background means that we look at things differently, even if we don't recognise it. So depending on the decisions we're making, what we think we see will affect what we decide to do. So we have to think about not just the data, but the context as well. So just to summarise, we have perception, which then helps us to form our opinions, rightly or wrongly, and those opinions can often turn into facts. Just because someone states an opinion does not mean it's a fact. Just because someone says something is true does not mean it is. It can also mean that you're missing facts. So when people are not aware of all the facts, sometimes they don't bother to ask for more information and they just judge instead. And I think it's very true to say when people don't have all the facts, they simply judge. So our perception can be really important for influencing our opinions, and then by some magic leap, we all do it, we turn those opinions into facts. And it's simply not true. It's worth driving home. Opinions are not facts. But our perception influences how we see the world, and hopefully the cognitive illusions will help you to see how that happens. So what can we do? It's not all bad. There have been some successes, and I'm going to share those with you now. Georgia State University has eliminated the gaps in academic performance based on factors such as race, ethnicity, and poverty. So we can do it if there is a will and there is an inclination to do so. There's lots of attention from various academic institutions to make things better. But we need proper processes in order to mitigate the effects. If there is not a fair process in place, then that lets people down. People's concepts of processes can sometimes show and reveal the priorities of the organisations. So if the processes are not there to keep people safe, then we know that's not a priority. And it's not good enough being like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Dorothy keeps repeating, "There's no place like home. There's no place like home." And she does this at the end of the film. And she squeezes her eyes really tight, and suddenly she's home again, right? Just simply repeating something does not make it true. I think we need to be more like Toto. In the film The Wizard of Oz, at the very end, Toto is a combination of the other characters. He has courage, heart, and wisdom. And he's the one who pulls back the green curtain to reveal everything that was happening behind it. So with that in mind, it's not enough just to keep saying something is true. We have to examine where the priorities are and where the processes could be improved. And that's really crucial. It's not enough just to have awareness. I actually don't really feel that awareness is what we should be striving for. I think it has to be about an action. So I keep hearing the phrase, we need to raise awareness of diversity. I think that is not enough. So Georgia State University improved their processes. They developed an early warning system, and the number of students that graduated from the university rose by 30% in 4 years. So if organisations really want to improve their processes and do better, then they can, but there has to be the inclination to do so. It can be the case that the answer is no before the question has been asked. It's also interesting to note that the number of black men getting a degree in science, technology, engineering and maths increased by 100%. Interestingly, there was also a 200% rise in the success rate for Hispanic students. So it can be done. So a quick summary, what do our illusions teach us? Our perception influences our opinion. But we see different things, and we need to remember those opinions are not facts, they can be changed. So what can we do to build on successes like that? There are not enough of them, obviously. In communities, we all love to belong to something bigger than ourselves. Nobody wants to be judged, and nobody wants to be left behind. Feeling behind is a feeling left out is one of the worst feelings in the world because we are social creatures. And if it happens in your professional arena, then that makes things very difficult for the individual. We realise that we're all human and everyone is imperfect. There's always room for judgment, people making mistakes, people taking you for granted, jumping to conclusions, thinking wrong things about you. But all of these obstacles should not stop us from trying to be inclusive, and they should not stop us from speaking out. When I look at the figures of today, what I see are the leaders of the people I admire who do speak out. Take, for example, the 17-year-old Pakistani girl who was shot in the head by the Taliban while she was on her way to school. Think about the 17-year-old girl with a shaved head from Parkland who stood in front of her country and asked that its laws should change. Also think of a 16-year-old girl in a boat across the Atlantic, making that dangerous and difficult journey to ask adults to think more carefully about how we use and abuse our climate and what we are leaving behind. These people are not silent. They are speaking out, and they serve as great examples for the rest of us. We can continue to be small and think about ourselves, or we can try and be inclusive and be inspired by those young women. I don't need to tell you their names, I'm not going to. I don't need to, because they speak out and we know who they are. So how can we change things to make things better, make people feel safe in our own environments? And we have to start off with the point that silent allies are not allies. They're not leaders. We don't remember the people who stood and said nothing. Equity. To be more inclusive, we have to give people equity. We have to make them feel included. There's different ways we can do that. It's even as simple in the workplace as asking people for their opinions. We have to start somewhere, and there's lots of small ways that you can do that. You can give people equity in the success of the organisation, help them to feel involved. So that's one example. We also have the example of engagement. How can we make sure that the quiet person in the room has got their opinions heard as well? I gave an example of women in the boardroom earlier. People forget they were there, or they forget what they said. And again, it's like they are not seen. And because they are not seen, they are not understood or valued. So we have to think about how can we engage people in a way that they are comfortable with. So that's an important thing. I think also it's about not just about people's orientation or their religion, it can be about their age as well. So for example, I am probably the wrong side of 40. Most people would see it as that. But I was brought up in consulting where you adopted a more formal way of writing emails. So for example, it was a major no-no to use someone's diminutive name, a nickname, or a shortened version of their name in an email. It was not business formal communication. So when I'm writing emails to somebody, I tend to use business formal email, and I use their full name to do that. So if your name is Andrew, I'm going to call you Andrew, and I won't call you Andy unless you invite me to do so. And that is for me just perhaps an age thing, a generation thing. But for me, that's business formal and it's polite. Someone younger than me who doesn't have that experience or background might regard it as rude because I have not called them Andy, but I've addressed them as Andrew, as an example. So I think when I look at these examples, it's a key concept to engage and to talk. And then if that person is upset because I'm not addressing them by their shortened name, then they can come and tell me that. Alternatively, they could not speak to me at all about it and go and talk to everyone else to say that I'm being insulting, which is simply not true. It's a communication issue. I haven't realised I've upset someone and they've told everyone else apart from me, and it's turned into a thing. Now for me, I think that's a diversity piece. It's probably age, and it's a way of starting to think about how people respond to things. And I think as I am getting older and I'm dealing with people much younger than me, I am seeing differences in business communication. One of my customers insists, for example, on messaging me through Instagram, which I am personally not very comfortable with, but I appreciate that is her preferred method of communication. So I see lots of photographs of her children, and then she'll ping me a personal message in very informal language to ask me how something's going. And for me, I have to work hard to undo the business formal language that I was schooled in as a consultant for quite large consulting firms. That was just what you did. And I have to relearn how she would prefer that I deal with her, that I speak to her. So I'm trying my best, but again, it's something that I think is something everyone can work on. And I think these things are growth areas for everyone. But I think the other side of it is other people having to work harder to understand that yes, other people have got different ways of communicating, and it's not that one is worse or bad. It's about understanding other people better and understanding my perspective as well as other people. So hopefully that explains a bit why engagement and how you engage can be really important. It's also interesting to inquire, ask questions. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous, but sometimes people are afraid to show their ignorance about a topic. Now, what I tend to do is I tend to admit freely that I am ignorant of a particular background and that I would like to know more. one of my ex-colleagues, and who may be watching this. If you are, you know who you are. You have taught me many valuable lessons that I have learned, and I thank you for that. I won't mention his name, but he was kind enough to share information about his Jewish faith with me that I didn't understand. And he was, and still is when I see him, incredibly patient when I had questions about simple things probably, but I would ask questions about, what are you reading? Tell me about the book you're reading. I can see it's about your faith. Please share with me if you'd like. If you don't want to, that's okay. But I'm really keen. And you know what? Every time I've asked someone or given someone that approach, I have never been rejected. Never been rejected. So I think if you ask earnest questions and you are honest and say, look, I am trying, then I think that humility shows that you're receptive to the different ideas. It doesn't mean that you accept those ideas, but it does mean you've made an effort to understand and respect them, and that you are seeing the differences, which means you are starting to understand them, which will eventually lead to valuing them and seeing what other lenses people bring to the discussions. So your content choice is not just limited to a particular lens. You have a wealth of people who are just so willing to share such kindness and generosity and sharing their backgrounds and their perspectives with you. And every time somebody does that, it is an absolute gift. We also have to think about expressions. So we see gender neutral language becoming more prevalent. So expressions are all also, as I mentioned earlier, about identifying how someone feels they should be addressed in email communication, for example. So that is just one area where I think the expressions do become more important. I think that if you ask someone about how they would prefer to be addressed, then they'll tell you. So, you know, they may use female pronouns, you may come across people who are transgendered, and what I find there is that pronouns are really crucial. Never use the wrong pronoun with somebody. So if somebody identifies as female, what's it to you to make sure that you don't offend them? What I mean by that is, what's your problem with it? Don't use the wrong pronoun. If they identify as female, what's the problem for you to give them that opportunity to use the pronouns that they prefer? So you might see a lot more of it because people are trying to normalise it. You know, the way I look at it is, I think giving people that dignity is important. Also, don't dead name people who are transgendered. Don't do it. One of my friends who's been through the transition turned up to a job interview and was dead named throughout the whole job interview. What I mean by that, instead of using her new name, the name that she uses and identifies with, that individual used the name that she was given at birth. And although I think there's a richness there because someone has lived through so many experiences, we can learn from people who have that degree of self-honesty. I think that we can all work harder and better to understand the pronouns that people are using. It's also about exposure. When did you last read a book by a black female, for example? Or when did you last read a book by someone who's LGBT? You know, I think it's good to expose ourselves to different perspectives in the world. And we can do that in so many different ways. Why not even do something like change your screensaver to expose yourself to different messages and different backgrounds? And sometimes I use photographs on my website, just as to break up the content really. And it's sometimes so hard to find images of technical females who are older. That's really hard. Or if you sometimes do a search for IoT women, you will get a picture of a female in a bikini holding a drone. And that is just undoing all sorts of messages. But we get subtly hit with all these messages all the time and we don't always realise it. That's why I showed the optical illusions right at the start. It's just something that is part of our brain. We are finding shortcuts all the time. So why not change your screensavers? Tweet me, LinkedIn, whatever, to let me know you've done it. And let me know how you found that. But we can do that to expose ourselves to different messages. Also think about the environment we're in as well. I've tried to use captions in the slide deck here. Sometimes environment can be too noisy for people to hear properly. We can also think about how we can change the environment so that the subtle perceptions are not being played out. So one role I had in consultancy meant that the office was decorated by the men in the office, so the calendars and all that stuff. So I came in one day and someone had put a calendar up, which was pictures of women in bikinis basically. So I just internally rolled my eyes about it because I thought, oh really, come on, this is a professional environment, you've got bikini shots everywhere. Then the operations director came in, ripped it up, took it down, and she was female, said that we were not having that in the office. And the guys couldn't understand what they'd done wrong at all. So I think that sometimes people get resentful because they feel they've been told off and they haven't done something that they feel is wrong. But it's about trying to look at things through different lenses. And sometimes the messages in our environment tell very much who we are. So we've got a picture here of a woman looking at a scene. So maybe if you have a home office or if you have a office environment, what pictures do you have up? Something as simple as that. What is your workplace saying about you and your environment? So have a think about that. And if you have any bikini pictures, take them off before I come and visit. I'm really not that interested in seeing them. So this model is called the stereotype inoculation model, and it's created by a researcher called Dasgupta. And the idea is about identifying conditions in the environment that can help us to think more carefully about the stereotypes that we have. We all have them, and the idea is our brain is trying to find shortcuts in the environment, but we have to identify where our shortcuts are actually impacting other people. And that's one of the ideas of trying to undo unconscious bias, or at least try to think about how we can do better as individuals. So empathy is important, obviously, in every walk of life, probably. Quotas do not equate to inclusion. So just because you have a certain number of women in your environment does not mean that they will be included. So empathy is a key aspect to that. So it's important to try and make sure that we are not victim blaming. That can happen quite a bit as well. And bullying people for speaking out, I think they should be supported. Just because one person says something and other people are ignoring them, it doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means that they stand alone, even though they are right. So it's about making sure there's enough space at the table for everyone, but we can also take charge as well. And there's a lovely quote which I read recently that said, if there's enough space, if there isn't a chair for you at the table, bring a deck chair. and come and join. And I think that is a good attitude to have. If there's no seat for you at the table, bring your own chair. And I think we can try and dial up the aspects of ourselves to try and overcome some of those unconscious biases as well. For example, I know I'm softly spoken. I have to work really hard to be heard in meetings very often. But it means I have to try and understand better that it's not that people are intentional about the way they are talking over me, but I have to find ways in which I can make sure that my voice is heard as well. I do sometimes try and find an ally sometimes as well, just to try and make sure that my voice carries. And I don't like having to do that, but that is unfortunately something that has to happen now and again. We saw an example a few years ago where the staff members in the White House were doing the same thing. So if a woman came up with an idea, then another woman would echo her or try and help her voice to carry. Empathy can help a long way with that. So here we've got just a quick study where we see interest in computer science between men and women. So this is an interesting story. I'm just going to see if we can find the link for this, which we've got here. And it's all about how stereotypical cues impact gender participation in computer science. So giving girls subtle cues that computers aren't really for them, or programming's not for them, they all add up. And I think sometimes women in technology issues are like death of 1,000 lashes. People think they get to decide how many lashes you've suffered, and they will make a judgment on that. But the thing is, all these lashes add up over time. And I think that's the problem with women in technology issues. Often it's not one big thing that you can hang in a peg to say, well, this happened and this is why I left IT. Sometimes it's you just had too many lashes over too many years and they just add up. So we have to think about what cues we're giving to people as well. So with that, I am going to give you some references to give credit and resources for further following up. University of Plymouth have got some great resources on how we can make people feel safe and more included. So that's actually written for the academic staff, but I think it would be good for organisations to adopt this as well. I've tried to create a decency charter for the technical community to use as an open source venture. It was never adopted and I never got any help for it and needed more help. It should not have been what Jen does. It was supposed to be a community effort. And it's a real shame that there was so little interest in trying to do something genuinely for diversity and inclusion. We can also think about Project Implicit, so this will help us to identify our own social attitudes. And it can ask us about our associations, so you can have a look at that. And here's some books that are worth reading. Whistling Vivaldi, more about stereotypes. Invisible Women is just a classic. I love that book, and there's so many facts and data in there about how the default male is used and the rest of us have to somehow squeeze into these shapes, and it's not always how the world works, not just for women but also for other characteristics like neurodiversity, age. We also need to think about sexual orientation. The thing is, we've all got quite similar struggles in many ways, but the people that really want to change the world can really make such a great impact by starting to think about how we can start small and get these things together and have them all add up. If those young girls can do it, then we can all do better. It's as simple as that. We should not show or think about being small, particularly as community leaders. And just a quote from Ferris Bueller: It's not always about the awards we win or the prizes that we have, or it's about stopping to think about the longer term impact on people and on each other. And I think what I'd like to see is more pauses. Practice the pause when you are considering how you treat other people. And if you're not considering how you treat other people, then maybe you should think about that. So it is good to have a stop. Practice the pause and think about how you can make other people's lives better, not just for you. Diversity and inclusion and equality are not marketing concepts to be used by organisations or individuals to further their careers. It has to be part of the DNA of the individual and the organisation. And the behaviour has to match what people are talking about. As if not, it's fairly clear fairly quickly that that's not where people are going. Just because someone is female doesn't mean they're right about everything about diversity either. I think sometimes there can be a culture of fear, but that's when it comes back to questioning as well. Questioning to make sure that we are not just basing our assumptions on evidence by one person, but we are using these frameworks and the evidence. I've given you some references to think about that broader lens and looking at things through diverse lenses. And finally, I want to say thank you for tuning in this long. If you have any questions, my details are here. And I hope the output of this video is that somebody somewhere, you can get in touch, will decide to try and champion this for the Microsoft MVP community. And I am over and out. Thank you very much.